Okay, so here we're going to look at worksheet 6. Um, so worksheet 6, we're talking about section 2.2, 2.3, and 2.4. So 2.2 is all about this mean, right? We were talking about means previously. But the difference now is we're talking about what's called a weighted mean. Okay, so let's check this out. So the following chart shows different job types at a local business. It also shows the number of employees and salaries of each job type. Find the average salary of each person working at the business. So again, it's a mean, right? So everyone says, okay, how do you find a mean? You add them all up and then divide by how many there are. So yes, there are 1, 2, 3, 4 different types of salaries here. All right, so we're going to add these all up, but you're not adding these up and dividing by 4 because what's really happening is this number of employees is telling you how many of each salary there really is. So think of it as like, yes, it's 56,000, but that's only happening once. That 32,000 is actually happening 4 times, right? So it's not just 4 numbers that we're averaging. It's 56,000, it's 32,000, 32,000, 32,000, 32,000. And then it's 27, 27, 27, 27, 27. And then it's 20, 20, right? So there's really a whole lot of numbers here. They're just 4 different types of them, right? So there's really 5, 10, 12 different people here. 1 of them is this, 4 of them is this, 5 is this, 2 is this. So there's really 12 different things here. So when you add them all up, you're really adding them all up. But you're going to add 56,000 one time. You're going to add 32,000 4 times. And again, it's that idea of that repeated addition, 32, 32, 32, 32. You can do the shortcut by just multiplying, right? So if we take the salary and multiply, that'll take the place of having to add them all up repeatedly, okay? Just for laziness, we're talking about thousands. We'll deal with the thousands later. But clearly this is only happening once, so it's 56. But that 32,000, or just 32, is happening 4 times, right? So it's really 128,000. And then the 27 is happening 5 times. That's the 135,000. And then the 20 is happening twice. There's your 40,000, right? So what you're really doing is you're doing 20, 20, but that's 40. You're doing 27, 27, 27, 5 times, right? But then when you add those all up, 56 plus the 128 plus the 135 plus the 40, right? There's your 359. Or really, what we're talking about is 359,000. Okay. So when you add them all up, that's that. But then we would need to divide by how many we're talking about. In this case, it's not the number of different types of salaries, but the total number of people, right? Which was that 12, right? 5, 10, 12, right? There's really 12 people here, right? So that's what we want to divide by 12, right? So you could do the 359,000 divided by 12, right? So you're really talking about this 29916.66, okay? Or basically you're talking about $29,916.66. That would be your average salary, right? Not gonna lie, this is kind of an easy one, but I think it might help to understand this one before I do the rest of these. So basically what it is, it's still an average, just like before. A mean, you're gonna add them all up and divide by how many there are. But now when you have, instead of thinking it was just these 4 things, these 4 things are pulling with different weights. That's why it's called a weighted mean, right? So this 27,000 is pulling 5 times as hard as this one, right? The 32,000 is pulling 4 times as hard. This one's pulling twice as hard, right? So if you take the things you're trying to average and you multiply by how much weight they have, and you add those totals, right? Then you would divide by the total weight, right? So it's like a tug of war. So imagine like these 4 things, but this one's pulling 4 times as hard. This one's pulling 5 times as hard. This one's pulling twice as hard, right? And then you divide it by the total weight. Okay. All right. So let's try this one. So suppose a student has earned the points given in the four following categories. The overall grade in the course uses the percent weights given in the second table. You want to calculate the overall grade by percentage and letter, right? Assuming 90, 80, 70, 60, blah blah blah, letter grades, usual stuff. So here's the thing: you can go through and you got to understand what it is saying. So the homework, they have a 110 out of 150. Right? So what that's talking about is you have a 73%. So they got a C going in the homework category. Okay. 82 out of 90. They got a 91. Oh, that's an A in the quiz category. Pretty good, right? Then a 95 divided by 150, right? That's a 63. Not so good. Okay. And then here, 42 out of 60, right? 70%, right? So that's a C in each category. Okay. So what we want to do is we want to take how they're doing in each category and then find an average for the overall class, right? So these grades are very similar to the salaries here. We're trying to average these numbers. The difference is these four things that are pulling in this tug of war to try to find the middle ground, to find the average, are each pulling differently. This tells you how much they're pulling by, just like up here, right? So this homework is going to be worth 25% of the overall grade. The quizzes is only worth 15. The test is worth 45, so it's a big, huge impact, right? It's going to have the biggest impact on the overall grade. And the final is worth 15%. Okay. By the way, this is very similar to how this actual class works, right? It works the same way. So you're taking the different categories and you multiply by the weight, and that will give you your adding them all up, and then you divide by the total weight, right? So, well, here, let me show you. So what I mean by that, what I would recommend doing is the homework, do it all in the calculator. It's 110 out of 150, right? But it's in the calculator right now, okay? And you're going to take and you're going to multiply that by its weight, but that's 25% or 0.25. Okay. Oh, I forgot to multiply. Hold on. 110 divided by 150. Okay. There's your grade. Multiply that by 0.25. Sorry, I forgot to hit multiply. All right. So that's going to give you this crazy number. Don't panic. Just wait. Okay. So this is 0.183. Technically, it's repeating, right? Keeps going forever. Okay. But this is very similar to what we're doing here. We're taking the things that we're trying to average, multiplied by the weight. Okay. Do the same thing with the next one. So let's do it over here. There we go. So 82 out of 90, right? That's their grade in the quiz category. But then we multiply by its weight, which is the 15%. Okay. So now here we are looking at 0.136 repeating. Okay. Then the test is 95 out of 150. Right. There's their grade in the test. You multiply by its weight, the 45%, so 0.45. So that's going to give you the 0.285. And then the final, 42 out of 60, multiply that by its weight, 15%. And that's going to give you the 0.105. Okay, I know these are crazier numbers, but just wait. You'll see there's a nice punchline here. But it is basically the same idea. We are taking the things we're trying to average, multiply by the corresponding weights, then we add these all up. Okay, so if we do the 0.183, it's repeating. Now it repeats forever, but just to get another, just put a bunch of threes just so that you can see, right? So we can get the right decimals, spots. Plus then the next one was the 0.13, bunch of sixes. And then the 0.285, and then find the 0.105. All right. So basically, it turns out to be 7099999, right? So the more threes you put in, the more sixes you use here, the more nines you would have been in here. So it really adds up to 0.71, right? Because it's a bunch of nines, which means it's really one. Okay. So then you're thinking, okay, there's my grade. 71% seems reasonable. But wait a minute. Okay. That's what we did here. So technically, this is the 0.71. We still need to divide by the total weight. But here, if you add these all up, 20, maybe I should check it out just to show you. The 25 plus 15 plus 45 plus 15 adds up to 100%. But what is 100%? 100% is the same as the decimal 1. So really, you're dividing by 1. It doesn't change the number. Okay, but it is that same thing. Okay, right? Because what you're doing here is you're adding up all the total weights, right? So just like before, when you add them all up and then you divide by the total weight, it just happens that the total weight is 100%, so it doesn't change. So in this case, it is 71%, or you've got a C. Not a big deal here, but I think it's going to make more sense what I mean by that when we do this one. Okay, so now. Let's say, suppose another student wants to know their overall grade using the same basic idea, using the same point, or at some point in the middle of the semester, right? But here are their grades, but you want to use the same percentage weights as up here. right? So now this person, it's a different homework grade, it's a different quiz grade, different test grade. They didn't even take the final yet. We're using these same weights, right? But here, the biggest difference is they did not take the final, okay? And that's what's the difference going to be here. Okay, so we can do the same basic idea. Their homework's 10 out of 50. That's a 20%. That's pretty bad, right? They're failing in the homework category. But again, that's going to be worth 20. I did it again. Right? You're going to multiply that by 25% because that's the weight. Okay. So that's the 0.05. Then 26 out of 30, right? So 86, 87, right? That's pretty good in the quiz category. But again, the quizzes are only worth 15. So we multiply by 15%. And then the test was 72 out of 100, which is, 72%, basically a C. Not great, but not bad, right? But again, the tests, remember, are worth 45%. So we're going to multiply that by 45. So this is 0.324. Now, they didn't take the final. So technically, this would be a 0 because they didn't take it, okay? But then when you add these all up, you're going to have 0.05 plus 0.13 plus 0.324, right? So when you add those all up, you have 0.504. Okay. Now, here's the biggest difference. This is not their final grade, or the overall grade. Here it was. But why is that? Only because they took everything. It was the total weight was 100%. So when you divide by the total weight, which was 100% or 1, it didn't change. But here, they didn't take everything. They didn't take the final, right? So the total weight is not 100%. It's the homework category, which is 25%, the quiz category, which is 15%, and the test category, which is 45%, right? So you can add those all up. So it's 25 plus 15 plus 45, or in other words, 85%, right? Or what you could have done is, what is the only thing they didn't take was the final, right? So the whole class, 100%, if you don't take the final, that's 85%, right? So this grade that they have here was based upon everything but the final. So it was only based upon 85% of the course. So when you multiply by the weight, add them all up, you're going to get this. But now you got to divide by the total weight, which is really 85%, right? Because see the difference though? Because here the total weight was 100. That's why it didn't change. But now it's not. It's only 85. So you're really taking that 0.504, right? That grade, and based upon only 85% of the course. There's their actual grade now, right? So this is 0.59, well, basically 3, right? Using the third slot. But what is that? That's basically 59%. It's still technically an F, but at least it's not as bad as 50. Okay. So you do have to watch out for that one a little bit. It's the same. All three of these are the same. You're taking the weight and multiplying by the whatever it is you're trying to average, add them all up. But then you got to divide by the total weight. Here, the total weight was different. Okay. Also, it's kind of worth talking about just like what's going on with this person, right? Why are they failing? Well, if you think about that test, 72 out of 100, remember that was a 72%. That's a C. That's not bad. I mean, it's not great, but it's not bad. 26 out of 30, that's an 86. That's almost an A, right? That's a B plus, right? Right. So they got a C going in the test category. They got a B plus going in the quiz category. Why are they failing? Right. They are failing because the homework is 10 out of 50. That's a 20%. That is a big time fail. Okay. So you may, even though you do well in the test and even on the quizzes, if you don't do the homework, it's still going to affect your grade. Right. So it's it's also a good public service announcement here. Make sure you do the homework. It is part of your grade too in this class as well. And not only helps understand the material, but it also is important for the grade. Okay. So let's take that a step farther. What if now, again, you consider that same class, same categories, same percentage weights from the previous two problems, but let's say a student doesn't want to do any homework. Okay. And unfortunately, some of you guys are actually in this category. If you don't do any homework, what I want to know is what would you have to get or calculate the grade they would need to earn in other categories altogether in order to just pass the course, right? At 70%. So basically, let's assume you don't do any homework. How well would you have to do in everything else just to pass the course? That's what we're after. Okay. The thing of it is here, in this case, we want to don't think of it as 4 categories, right? Don't think of it as homework, quizzes, tests, final, right? Right. So it's not all of these categories. Think of it as homework, which is 25%, and then everything else. So everything else would be 75%, right? If you added the rest of these up would be 75%, or 25% goes to homework, less than 100, 75% is everything else. Okay. So basically, if their homework grade, let's say their actual score here, their grade was 0. They don't do any homework. This is what we're trying to figure out. What would the grade have to be in everything else just to pass the course? Okay. So how do we find their overall grade overall? Right? You take basically the grade that they're getting, multiplied by the percentage, and then you add those all up. Okay. So they have a 0 going in the homework. Technically, that would be times the weight 25. And then you do the same thing with the other one. I don't know what the grade is, but that's going to be worth 75. You add those all up. Then technically you divide by the total weight. But again, the total weight would now be 100%, right? Because the total weight here would be 100%. But that's just 1, right? So it's that same thing. You're taking the grade, multiply by percentage. Grade times the percentage. Add them all up, divide by the total. Okay? But the difference here is I don't know what this is. But I do know you want a 70%. So what I'm looking for is what would this number have to be? So when you did all this calculation, it ended up being a 70%. Right? Okay. Well, divided by 1 is not going to change anything. Multiplying by 0, basically this goes away. So that means there's some number out there times 0.75. That will give me 0.70. So that's what we're looking for. What number times 0.75 would give me 0.7? Well, if you're trying to figure out what number multiplies, you're kind of going backwards. So what would multiply? You would do the opposite. You would divide. So I'm looking for 0.70 divided by 0.75, right? So if you take 0.7 and basically divide by 0.75, you're going to get this 93.3, or basically 93, right? So what does that mean? That means you would have to average a 93% on everything else just to pass the course if you don't do any homework, right? Think about also what that means, okay? This is a side note now, right? Just kind of, it's a bonus to this question. Let's say you take a test. This is where it would be great if we're in class because I would ask you. But let's say you take a test, right? And you got an 82% on the test. And you're this person, right? You don't do any homework. Right? You don't do any homework at all, but you took a test and you got an 82% on the test. What does that mean? That means you just failed this class, right? Because think about that. 82%, you're thinking, hey, that's a B. That's pretty good, right? 82%, that's a B. But if you don't do any homework, your average on everything else would have to be 93%. Now, averaging means that's the middle ground. So, like, visualize here's 93. Right? If you average 93, if there's anything below it here, you would have to get something the exact same amount above it in order to get to that middle of 93. So if you get a test on an 82, which is 11 points away from 93, in order to average 93, you would have to get something 11 points above to counterbalance that 82 below, right? But 93 plus 11, that's going to put you at 104. So if you get an 82 on the test, you'd have to get 104 on something else just to balance to get to 93. But that's over 100%. You can't do that, right? So basically the point here ultimately is it's a good problem to figure out what you would need, but it's also, again, a good public service announcement. Do the homework, right? It's part of the grade. It's important. Right now. Okay. Another type of average here, right? You guys have probably seen GPA, or grade point average. Okay. So a grade point average or a GPA calculates how you're doing overall in your courses. Okay. So you guys probably heard GPAs. Oh, it's out of a 4.0, right? Everybody hears that 4.0. But what does that mean? Well, what's really talking about here is if you get an A in a class, you get 4 points. If you get a B, you get 3. C is 2, D is 1, F is 0. So like kind of visualize like a number line. Here's 0, here's 1, here's 2, here's 3, here's 4, right? So if you're no, if you're have an F at 0, a D is 1, a C is 2, a B is 3, and then an A is 4. Okay. So things like, and just to make the point, like you may have probably heard, like if someone's getting a 3.15 GPA, what does that mean? 3.15, that means it's between a 3 and a 4. So it's a B, but it's closer to B than an A, right? If someone's GPA was like 2.76, right? Well, 2.76, where is that? Well, 2.76 is in between 2 and 3, but that 7.6 is closer to 3. So it's like you're talking about a C average, but you're closer to a B than a low C, right? That's what we're talking about here. Okay, so how do I calculate someone's GPA? Well, this particular semester in the English class, right, 3 credit hours, it was a grade of C. That means they earned 2 points, right? They got a D in this math class, right? It was only 1 point. And they got a B in biology, right? That was 3 points. And they got a C in this psychology class, so that's 2, right? So the grade corresponds to a letter. Okay, so now, same idea as before. We are trying to average these grades or these scores. But how hard is each one of these pulling is based upon the credit hours, okay? And this is really how GPA works. So this 6 credit hour class, that one's going to be pulling the hardest. It's pulling with a weight of 6, or this is only pulling with weight of 3. This is pulling with weight of 5. And this is pulling with weight of 3, right? So it's kind of that same idea. These are the things that we're trying to average, but you have to multiply by how hard it's pulling, right? So 3 times 2, 6. 1 times 6, 6. 3 times 5, 15. 2 times 3, 6. Then you could add these all up, right? But I mean, if you need to, you got the calculator. 6 plus 6 plus 15 plus 6, right? 33. But now we go off to the side and you would have to divide by the total weight. But the total weight was based upon the credit hours, right? This is how hard each one was pulling. So this is the total credits or the total weight. So 3 plus 6 plus 5 plus 3, there's your 17, right? So you would take 33 and divide by 17. It's that same idea. Take the things you're trying to average and multiply by the weight, add them all up, then divide by the total weights. All right. So 33 divided by 17 gives me this, which usually with GPAs, they round it to 2 decimal places. So it's 1.94. And since that's a 1, you would go down. All right. So this semester, this person is averaging 1.94, which means that's slightly below a 2, right? 1.94 is slightly below 2. So it's a high D average, which hopefully seems reasonable, right? I mean, like, think of the C's are right in the middle. This D is going to pull it, like, you know, the C's are right in the middle, right? These two are right in the middle here. The D is going to pull it down, but the B is going to pull it up. But that D is pulling a little bit harder than the B is. So that's why it goes down instead of up overall. Right? All right. Do the same thing for the second semester. Okay. Again, they got a C here, 2 points, C here, 2 points, 3 for the B, 2 for the C. Multiplied by the credits, 6, 6, 15, 6. Add those all up, 33. Okay. The difference now is when you add up the credits, right? 3, 6, 9 plus 5 is 14. So you're really doing 33 divided by 14 now, right? So if you did 33 divided by 14, now you have a, well, 2.35, but wait, this will make it go up. So 2.36. All right. So this semester, they're in the C world, 2.36. So 2.5 would be right in the middle. So it's a little bit on the lower end of a C, right? As opposed to a high C. Okay. So now, how would you calculate the cumulative GPA? Well, if this semester they got a 1.94, and this semester they got a 2.36, you might be thinking, why don't I just average these two numbers, right? Meaning you add them, divide by 2. Okay, so let's say I did 1.94, added the 2.36. Oh, no, I forgot the decimal. 1.94 plus 2.36, right? 194, 2.36. That's going to give you a 4.3. but then I want the middle of that, so you would divide that by 2, so 2.15. Okay. All right. Now, this is a reasonable idea, but it turns out this is incorrect. Why is that? Well, let's think about that. 1.94, imagine our number line is here, 2.36 is up here. Where would 2.15 be? It would be smack dab right there in the middle, right? That's what you did. When you average things, you add them divided by 2, you are finding the direct middle, okay? The problem is why would your cumulative GPA not be right smack dab in the middle of these two? It's because they're pulling with different weights, right? That's the whole point of this stuff here, right? Yes, you're trying to find the middle of these, you're trying to find an average, but this one is pulling harder than this one, right? So if they were pulling equally, we would expect it to be right in the middle here. But this one's pulling harder, which means we would expect it to be a little bit lower, right? Again, picture like that tug of war, right? If they were pulling equally, it would be right here. But this one's pulling harder than this one, so we would expect it probably somewhere in this region, right? So how do I actually calculate it? Well, the problem is since they're based upon different credits, don't think of it as two different semesters. Just think of it as one big long semester, right? So it's basically you're going to do all of it, add them all up, or 33 plus 33, there's your 66, and then divide by the total credits, which is the 17 plus 14, or 31. Right. So if you did it, and basically, don't even think of it as like 33 and 33. Think of it as you're going to do it for all these. You're adding up all, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You're adding up all 8 classes, and you're divided by the total credits of all 8 classes, right? So it's really 66 divided by 31. So 66 divided by 31, there's your 2.13. Right. So I think it's worth calculating this number so that you can see the whole point here. The whole idea here is if these things were evenly weighted, it would give you right smack dab in the middle. But these things are not evenly weighted. This one's pulling a little bit harder because look, where is 2.13? Slightly below 2.15. So it stands to reason this makes more sense. So it's worth doing this, but that's not the right way. This is the better way because now it takes in the different weights, right? All right, just for time's sake, let me stop the video here, and then the second part we'll do in a separate video.